Hi everyone, this is Laelie with another Innominatus video guide from the patch 4.3 PTR. This video will outline the strategy to Ultraxion, the 5th boss in the Dragon Soul raid. This fight is by no means complete and will likely change before it hits the live realms. Ultraxion can be found at the top of Wormrest Temple. Your raid must watch some in-game dialogue, fight waves of Twilight dragon trash, and then Ultraxion flies up to the edge of the temple where your raid will engage him. Ultraxion is a one-phase fight that increases in difficulty as the fight progresses. He has a 6-minute hardened rage mechanic that will be discussed later in this guide. Your raid must use a special ability effectively and make use of the encounter mechanics to survive this healing and DPS test. Your raid will need 2 tanks, 3 healers, and 5 DPS. This fight requires your tanks to swap with one another at crucial points, and your raid will sustain massive AoE damage throughout the encounter. I will first cover the abilities Ultraxion will use, and then outline the strategy for defeating this encounter. Encounter abilities. Ultraxion will use Unstable Monstrosity, which causes him to hit the raid for 300,000 damage split between everyone within 30 yards of the initial target. This ability is used every 6 seconds at the start of the fight. For each minute the fight continues, this ability will be cast 1 second faster with a maximum cast rate of 1 cast per second. This ability will also prevent Ultraxion from parrying attacks. Ultraxion will also cast Twilight Shift at the start of the fight. This will pull all players into the Twilight Realm and grant them Heroic Will. Your raid will have to use this special ability often during this fight. It will pull the caster out of the Twilight Realm for 5 seconds, but the player will be unable to attack, cast, or move during this time. If you are using the standard Blizzard UI, Heroic Will appears as a purple-white button just above your action bars. If you like to use custom action bar add-ons, this macro can be made and used to cast Heroic Will. /click, extra, action, button, 1. You may also wish to keybind this ability, which will have the same effect. The keybind feature is under the action bar functions header near the top of your keybindings window in the WoW menu. I will explain the use of this ability later in this video. It is vital that this ability is readily usable during this fight. Ultraxion will use Fading Light every 15 seconds during the fight. This ability will target the current tank and one other random player. Fading Light will draw those 2 raiders into the Twilight Realm for 5 to 10 seconds. If the player is in the Twilight Realm when this ability expires, they will instantly die. Raiders in the normal realm will be pulled back into the Twilight Realm and given a debuff called Faded into Twilight. It appears that the healers and the tank that does not currently have aggro on Ultraxion cannot be targeted by this ability, but it has not been confirmed. Players with Faded into Twilight will drop all threat against Ultraxion for 10 seconds and will be unable to generate threat for 10 seconds. This will affect your tanking rotation. Ultraxion will cast Hour of Twilight every 45 seconds. This spell has a 5-second cast time with a large purple energy ball graphic. This ability will do 300,000 unresistible shadow damage to anyone in the Twilight Realm. Players that are in the normal realm will be pulled back into the Twilight Realm. If no one takes damage from Hour of Twilight, the shield protecting the aspects will be destroyed and will wipe the raid using another ability called Twilight Eruption. Twilight Eruption will be used 6 minutes into the fight. Ultraxion will explode, dealing lethal damage to all raiders and himself. This is a hardened rage mechanic that your raid must beat in order to kill the boss. Also, if no raid member takes damage from Hour of Twilight, Ultraxion will instantly use this ability and wipe your raid. In order to prevent Twilight Eruption from wiping your raid, each of your DPS will need to do about 31,500 DPS, not including tank DPS. If your tanks are doing around 10,000 DPS each, that number is closer to 27,500. Twilight Burst is used when one or more players is outside of melee range of Ultraxion. This ability will hit everyone in the raid for 75,000 unresistible shadow damage and increases magical damage taken by 50% for 6 seconds. This effect can stack, so it is very important all raiders stay in melee range of the boss. The aspects will aid your raid during this encounter. Each aspect will grant a different buff that will help your raid defeat Ultraxion. Alexstrasza will give one healer Gift of Life, which appears 75 seconds into the fight as a red crystal just behind the raid group, which must be clicked by the chosen healer. This ability increases that player's healing done by 100% for the rest of the fight. This ability should be given to a healer with strong dot-based healing like a Restoration Druid or a Holy Priest. Ysera will give one healer Essence of Dreams, which appears 140 seconds into the fight as a green crystal just behind the raid group, which must be clicked by the chosen healer. This ability will cause all healing spells to be duplicated and heal evenly between all players within 50 yards for the rest of the fight. This ability should be given to a healer with strong direct healing, such as a Restoration Shaman or a Holy Paladin. Kalecgos will give one healer Source of Magic, which appears 200 seconds into the fight as a blue crystal just behind the raid group, which must be clicked by the chosen healer. This ability will reduce the mana cost of all spells by 75% and increase spell haste by 100%. This ability should be given to a healer with mana issues and or long cast time AoE heals, such as a Discipline Priest, Restoration Druid, or Restoration Shaman. It is important to note that each healer may only have one buff at a time from these three aspects. Our raid chose to give Gift of Life to one of the Restoration Druids, Essence of Dreams to the Restoration Shaman, and Source of Magic to the other Restoration Druid. Your raid may choose to switch these assignments to suit your healer composition, but the recommendations made here work best in any situation. Nozdormu will give all players the Time Loop buff 275 seconds into the fight. This buff will bring any player that would have died to 100% health and then remove the Time Loop buff. This buff is especially important at the end of the fight when AoE damage becomes very intense. Finally, Thrall will give the tanks Last Defender of Azeroth, which reduces the cooldown of all defensive abilities by 50% and increases the duration of them by 100% for the entire fight. Your tanks will need to make good use of this buff to survive some of the mechanics in this fight. Now that the abilities for Ultraxion have been explained, here's the encounter strategy shown in this video. Encounter strategy. Your entire raid will need to stack up in melee range in front of Ultraxion. This positioning will allow your raid to maximize AoE healing, as well as avoid the Twilight Burst ability. Ultraxion will not land on the platform, but your melee will be able to DPS him without concern for him parrying their attacks because of Unstable Monstrosity. Ultraxion will begin to use Unstable Monstrosity on the raid, which will begin the massive AoE damage your raid will sustain throughout the fight. Your healers will need to use light AoE healing at the start of the fight, and conserve mana until the later minutes of the fight when the raid healing will intensify. Every 45 seconds, Ultraxion will use Hour of Twilight, which will do massive damage to anyone still in the Twilight Realm. Everyone in the raid except the current tank will need to use Heroic Will, which will prevent them from taking the damage. The best time to use this ability is 2 to 3 seconds into the cast time. This will allow your DPS and healers to finish their cast and still have enough time to hit the Heroic Will button. Your tank that is staying in the Twilight Realm will need to use a major cooldown to survive, such as Survival Instincts, Shield Wall, Guardian of Ancient Kings, or Icebound Fortitude. Your tank must stay in the Twilight Realm for this ability or the raid will wipe due to Twilight Eruption. Fading Light will occur 2 times between each Hour of Twilight, and each cast will occur 15 seconds apart. Your second tank should taunt the boss off the first tank at this point. Both the tank and random raid member must wait until they have less than 5 seconds left on the debuff. When this happens, both players must use Heroic Will. Note that when the tank with Fading Light returns to the Twilight Realm, they cannot generate any threat for 10 seconds. The tricky part of this encounter requires your tanks to manage the taunt swapping between Fading Light and Hour of Twilight. When a taunt swap occurs, the current tank should hold aggro on Ultraxion until the next taunt swap needs to be made. This will ensure that the tanks alternate taking Hour of Twilight and will have cooldowns available each time because of Last Defender of Azeroth given by Thrall. An example scenario looks like this. Step 1. Tank number 1 tanks Ultraxion and gets Fading Light. Tank number 2 taunts. Tank number 1 uses Heroic Will. Step 2. Tank number 2 tanks Ultraxion and gets Fading Light. Tank number 1 taunts. Tank number 2 uses Heroic Will. Step 3. Tank number 1 tanks Ultraxion. Tank number 2 taunts on Hour of Twilight. Tank number 2 uses Major Cooldown. Tank number 1 uses Heroic Will. Step 4. Tank number 2 tanks Ultraxion and gets Fading Light. Tank number 1 taunts. Tank number 2 uses Heroic Will. Step 5. Tank number 1 tanks Ultraxion and gets Fading Light. Tank number 2 taunts. Tank number 1 uses Heroic Will. Step 6. Tech number 2 tanks Ultraxion. Tech number 1 taunts on Hour of Twilight. Tech number 1 uses Major Cooldown. Tech number 2 uses Heroic Will. These 6 steps will repeat until the boss dies. Your tanks must maintain this rotation in order to make sure that there is a major cooldown available for every Hour of Twilight. Your healers have the task of making use of the buffs provided by the aspects. The first buff is Gift of Life, which should be picked up by your designated healer 75 seconds into the fight. This buff appears as a red crystal that must be clicked to use. The second buff is Essence of Dreams, which appears 140 seconds into the fight as a green crystal. The final healer buff is Source of Magic, which appears 200 seconds into the fight as a blue crystal. These buffs are essential to sustaining enough AoE healing to keep your raid alive. Heroism should be used when Nozdormu casts Time Loop on your raid, or at 40% health remaining, whichever comes first. Your DPS should save potions and other consumables for this stage of the fight. Healers must also save raid cooldowns for this stage because the AoE healing will begin to strain them. The Hardened Rage will wipe your raid instantly, so Ultraxion must die before the 6-minute mark. Ultraxion is a difficult encounter, which will test the abilities of your tanks, healers, and DPS. Once your raid has mastered the use of Heroic Will, and your AoE healing and boss DPS is sufficient, Ultraxion will fall. I have included footage of the entire fight so that you can see the abilities and strategies in action. Put on your Sunday dresses, and have fun.